Now, different kinds of research lead to different kinds of conclusions. In addition to producing either quantitative or qualitative data, or sometimes both, research studies typically fall into one of four general categories: descriptive, correlational, experimental, or quasi-experimental. And actually, I kind of put experimental and quasi-experimental more together than not. So the first one, descriptive, describes a situation. It's going to give you the least amount of information out of all of these different types of research. Their purpose is to capture the current state of affairs regarding a real-world issue or problem, and sometimes to identify associations. But they cannot predict something about one variable based on another variable, and they can't help you draw a conclusion about a cause and effect relationship. So an example of a question that a descriptive study could answer would be, how well have students performed on a recent national achievement test? Now, with correlational studies, a correlational study explores possible relationships among two or more variables, so it's a step up from a descriptive type of study. Correlational studies, their purpose is to identify associations. So they enable predictions about one variable based on knowledge of another variable. They also provide an alternative when experimental manipulations are unethical or may be impossible. They do have some limits, and one of them is that they cannot prove cause and effect relationships. So a good example question that a correlational study could answer would be, are better readers also better spellers? So when we're looking at descriptive and correlational studies, they describe things as they naturally exist in the environment. They are not experimental. Correlational studies enable us to draw conclusions about correlation, the extent to which two characteristics or phenomena tend to be found together or to change together. So two variables are correlated when one increases as the other increases, which is called a positive correlation, or when one decreases as the other increases, which is called a negative correlation. And they do so in a somewhat predictable manner. Now, experimental studies and quasi-experimental studies, actually, their purpose is to manipulate one independent variable in order to observe its possible effect on another dependent variable. So the second variable depends on the first variable. We try to eliminate other plausible explanations for observed outcomes, especially in carefully controlled experimental studies. And these studies enable conclusions about cause and effect relationships. There are some limits. They may not completely eliminate other explanations because it's a hard thing to do, and it may force artificial circumstances or lab conditions. So, a good example question for an experimental study would be, which of two reading programs produces greater gains in reading comprehension? Do different kinds of tests, like multiple choice versus essay tests, encourage students to study in different ways? Now, with experimental studies, often they involve two or more groups that are treated differently. So let's say a researcher gives one group of students an intensive instructional program designed to improve their study skills. Then the researcher gives another group of students no instruction, and then gives a third group of students instruction in subject matter unrelated to study skills whatsoever. In this example, it includes treatment groups that are recipients of a particular intervention. The example includes two control groups, one that receives no intervention and another that receives a placebo intervention that's unlikely to affect the dependent variable in question. So the dependent variable would be study skills. The independent variable would be this intensive instructional program. Now, one other thing to mention is in experimental studies, they are always better if the subjects in the groups are assigned randomly. So typically, if you see something where things or subjects are randomized or they're assigned randomly, that's a good indication that it could be an experimental or a quasi-experimental study. Now, with quasi-experimental studies, they're usually used and conducted when in the study you can't control for all potentially influential variables, and therefore you can't completely rule out alternative explanations for the results that are obtained. Both of them, both experimental and quasi-experimental, enable us to draw conclusions to different degrees about causation, about why behaviors occur. Drawing conclusions about cause and effect relationships requires that all other possible explanations for an outcome be eliminated. Now, principles and theories can help synthesize, explain, and apply research findings. A theory is an integrated set of concepts and principles developed to explain the underlying mechanisms of a phenomenon. So, educational psychologists build theories over time based on evidence, not purely on speculation. So theories can help us both explain and predict human behavior, and so they give us numerous ideas about how best to help students achieve academic and social success at school.